name is Jim Skee, and I'm Research Director for the UK Energy Research Centre, and it's my pleasure to chair this keynote session this afternoon. The speaker is Charles Hendry, Minister of State at the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and Charles has been MP for Wealdon since 2001, was previously an MP for High Peak in Derbyshire. His list of responsibilities at the deck is dizzying when you actually take a look at it. It ranges from the mind-bogglingly complex electricity market reform. He has country responsibilities for EU, Russia, North Africa, Middle East. But interestingly, at the top of that list of responsibilities is security of supply, resilience and emergency preparedness. Now, just one thing to say, for those of you who've interacted with Charles, you'll be aware that he is really on top of his subject and has a grasp of the detail. He's open to ideas and evidence from outside. So I think this promises to be a very interesting session. Can I just say one remark about the procedures? The speech itself is going to be on the record, but the short Q&A we're going to have afterwards is off the record, and if you want to report anything, you should get the permission of Charles's office and RUSI before that actually happens. But without further ado, can I pass over to the Minister?
Jim, thank you very much. I always work on the basis that everything I say should be considered on the record, because if it's juicy enough, you'll use it. And so that we consider anything which I say you can use it, but don't hold against me. When you become a minister, that you get that exciting phone call from the Prime Minister and you turn up at your department. And there are the things which one assumes are the trappings of ministerial office, so you can actually tell your children that what it's like to be a minister. But the ministerial car has gone. We don't use that anymore. We use green tomatoes to go around London, or buses. The red box you're not allowed to take outside the department or to show it in public, and so that one doesn't have the same impact as it used to. But the thing which really does have an impact is when you're sat down by some of your senior officials and told the degree of your responsibilities as a minister in terms of national energy security and the facilities which we have in this country, which are absolutely central to keeping the lights on, which people assume just day in, day out will work, and that is your job as Minister to make sure we've got the right policies in place to ensure that we deliver on security of supply. And many of you will have heard me say before that people will forgive government many things, but the lights going off is not one of them. And that I would be on the Today programme and I would be gone by lunchtime. You won't know about it because your radios won't be working, so you won't hear the interview. But I would undoubtedly have departed. And I think it's extraordinary now, looking back over a year and a half as time as a minister, to see just how different the challenges are today from where we started. And it all looked pretty challenging 18 months ago. But in the time since then, we've seen Macondo in the Gulf of Mexico, which happened just before the general election, and all of the implications which that has brought for the oil and gas drilling, and particularly in deep waters, and the implications that would have for future policy in the United Kingdom. We've seen Fukushima and the terrible consequences of that, and the decisions which have been made in other countries around the world about the future role which nuclear can play. We've seen the crisis in the Middle East, so countries which we know are critical to our energy provision, and what that's done initially in terms of prices, but more generally in terms of instability, and realising that partners who we hope we can look to for delivering our oil and gas for many years to come as our own resources decline, that the pressures which they're under and the issues which affect them. And so a difficult landscape has become all the more difficult in that time. And I hope that what we've shown is in response to those external shocks, which obviously could not have been predicted, that we have taken a measured approach. But above all, it has shown the stability of the regimes which we have in place for safety and security. And that they have, I think, come through. We will constantly look to see how we can improve them. But overall, that there's been a great sense, I think, of recognition that the approach which we've taken in most of these areas has been broadly right. After Fukushima, we said that if there were any lessons that we could learn for the United Kingdom, we would of course do so. We asked Mike Waitman, who you'll be hearing from later, to lead the work into that, and he was given a brief to go as wide as he wanted and to cover any issue which he felt was appropriate. And so that we could be certain that in looking at the future nuclear policy for the United Kingdom, that recognising there are major differences, we're not an earthquake zone, we don't have tsunamis, that if there were other issues which we should learn, then we would do so. I think we're very lucky in Mike Waitman. We have somebody of international stature, somebody who was asked by the International Atomic Energy Agency to do their own international work into the post-Fukushima lessons, and that his report, as you'll be aware, was published yesterday. And I think that has reinforced our belief that we have a very strong safety regime in nuclear, and we've always been clear that we do want to see new nuclear as part of the mix going forward, but it has to be done on the basis of being without public subsidy and with no compromises taken on security and safety issues. There were some lessons which we've learned, like the need for regulators and industry to work more closely together to deliver continuous improvements, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But we've also been putting in place measures to give an enhanced role for the Office of Nuclear Regulation. We were concerned that it was too much caught up in the general panoply of government, and I think that much as I was surprised to discover, Jim, some of the things which were on my responsibilities, when Ian Duncan-Smith became Secretary of State for Works and Pensions, he probably didn't realise that nuclear security and oil and gas security was part of his remit. And so we're giving the ONR a greater degree of independence so it can staff up appropriately to respond to the issues and the challenges which are there, and to make sure that it's not going to be tied up by other wider government complications as it deals with the work which it has to do. I think we also recognise we need to do more in terms of coordination in the event of a disaster. And whilst everything will be done to ensure that we don't have that disaster, the very, very brave people who dealt with the consequences of Fukushima have shown us the need for very close integration, the need for people to be relatively close to where an incident may occur, and for real coordination between the emergency services. And we will never be embarrassed about looking for better international standards we can apply to our own. If there's anything which we think other people do better, we will be more than happy to look at that and see how it can be applied to our own circumstances here in the United Kingdom. And on that basis, we believe that nuclear can and should be part of the mix going forward. And I think that is an incredible contrast to other countries. And we've seen the understandable consequence in Japan of a decision to take nuclear out of their future energy mix. But then we've also seen it in Germany, in Italy, in Austria and Switzerland. And therefore fundamental new policies emerging in those countries as they try to deliver energy security in a low-carbon way without nuclear being part of the equation. But if you look at the United Kingdom, and I think this does come back to the rational approach and the independence of our regulatory approach, then public confidence in many polls in nuclear has actually risen since Fukushima. And that we are in a very different position from many other countries. And with those precautions and with those measures in place, we do believe we can take this forward. But I think the other thing which it shows us is that energy security requires a balanced portfolio. I said to a conference a year or so ago that if a nuclear incident happened in another part of the world with using different technology from those which we use, then it could have a dramatic impact on public confidence here. And somebody laughed at me and said, "Don't be ridiculous, that's not going to happen." Well, a few months later it did. And that we can't be putting all of our eggs in one basket. We don't need to. And that's why we're looking at the development of clean coal and clean gas technologies, why we're looking at the major rollout of renewables, because they all reinforce each other. And that just as when Sizewell B was out of operation for 7 months last year, or when Torness was closed down for a couple of days because jellyfish invaded its inlet pipes, that these things couldn't be predicted, but in order to have a balanced and secure energy policy, that we need as government to pursue a mixed portfolio. We also then had to learn the lessons from the Gulf of Mexico. 11 people were killed, 4.9 million barrels of oil released into the oceans. And that, for many people, was seen to be a turning point for deep drilling. We have a long history of deep drilling. Since the 1970s, 315 deep wells have been drilled in British territorial waters, and that we have great expertise. We have probably some of the greatest expertise anywhere in the world. And the response which we've taken to that was to look at how we can improve the standards further, but how we don't see those diluted by international cooperation or collaboration in a way that may actually undermine the ability of nation states to deliver the highest standards of security. It was very encouraging to us for the United States government to say that they thought they needed to be more like the United Kingdom. The Presidential Commission's report actually highlighted the North Sea regime as being one of the best in the world, which should be an example for them to follow. And so that we have built that in, that we have that confidence that others who looked at this independently recognise the nature and the high quality of our system. But also we've taken the steps of increasing the number of inspectors. We've increased the number of inspections from 60 a year to 150 a year. And we've put greater emphasis on stronger oil pollution emergency plans. So I think, again, a measured approach. But it comes back to the fundamental strength of the British regime for dealing with our energy infrastructure, which is one of ever-improving standards. This is not a tick-box regime, which is what you find in many countries, where some inspector goes round and ticks a box and says, I have checked this, I am satisfied, this is okay. The requirement here in all of these sectors is that year in, year out, industry itself has a legal responsibility to adhere to the best possible standards. And that means that industry is constantly looking at how it does things best and coming up with higher standards than government could actually impose of itself. If we look at the reaction of the oil and gas industry to the helicopter crash a couple of years ago, as a result of those measures, industry-led, in terms of putting in place better standards. We probably have the best helicopter standards anywhere in the world in the offshore sector, and that is because industry took the lead and said that they were not prepared to take any risks in this sector. Similarly, the work which has been done in the industry in developing a capping device, we now have one. I sort of opened it, if that's a technically correct phrase, in Aberdeen a few weeks ago. It shouldn't be opened, I suppose, it should be closed. Which shows that in the course of just over a year, industry-led solutions have been delivered, which means that a capping device can be taken within a matter, will be starting to be moved within a matter of hours of an emergency. So the real crisis which we saw developing in the United States, we believe, can be mitigated here. We also had to see to learn the lessons from what was happening in the Middle East, and that saw oil prices going up to $120 a barrel in April, the highest level they'd been for 2.5 years. And that as part of our response to that, through the International Energy Agency, we went through a stock release to try and show that there was no pressure on supply. There wasn't pressure on supply. The upward pressure on prices came from nervousness primarily. And it was quite clear, talking to Saudi Arabia, that they had the capacity to increase production and would do so if there were constraints. And I think we should actually praise them very greatly for the courage which they showed at the OPEC meeting to try and make sure that the issues of global oil supplies were addressed adequately and responded to. But it does show us, too, the importance of maintaining our own indigenous resources. We know that these are inevitably in decline. We know that we're now net importers of gas, and oil is following in that respect. But there is a tremendous national interest gain in Britain for optimising the returns. That the current measures would deliver perhaps another 11 billion barrels of oil equivalent. That optimising it could deliver 24 billion barrels. Those 13 billion barrels of oil equivalent are worth £1 trillion to the British economy. And therefore we need to put in place measures which will try and encourage that investment. And whilst I recognise, and I'm seeing Paul Warwick down there, the reaction which the industry had to the tax changes recently, moving forward from that and putting in place a new fiscal group to work with industry on those issues, looking at how we deal with infrastructure issues and decommissioning issues, I think shows an approach of problem solving to try and stimulate the investment in those perhaps smaller discoveries than has historically been the case, but to do that in a way that really recognises our national interest and our security interests as well. that we also will be seeing the rollout further of renewables, because that really reduces our dependency on imported fossil fuels. I have no idea where the price of oil or gas is going to be in 6 months, 12 months, 3 years' time, but we do know that the wind resource is going to be there. We know we can put a price on it in terms of the renewable obligation certificates which will be granted, and having that as part of the mix is actually part of the way of delivering energy price security to the country as well. With our critical national infrastructure, that I'm astounded by how many parts of that there are in different parts of the country, and our focus is on how we protect that. We've seen over recent years it coming under a great deal of stress. That last year was one of the coldest winters for 100 years. 20 of the coldest days in the last century, 20 of the highest days of gas demand in the last century happened in December. And so that we found that we went into the new year with unexpectedly low gas reserves, that we would normally expect to go into the new year with quite a high level. And the complexity of the market now, I think, delivered the gas security which we needed through the winter. Had we seen something worse than a mild spring, it would have been more challenging. But at the same time, that the LNG connections, the pipeline connections which have been put in place, have massively added to our energy security, but inevitably in the process deliver installations which require greater degrees of protection from failure, from climatic conditions, or from terrorist attack. The flood defences, similarly, that we had a programme earlier this year which is called Exercise Watermark, to see how the flood defences would cope in excessively bad flood conditions, and how our critical national infrastructure would actually come through that process. This is an important part for us in government, understanding where the pressures are, with something which we do on a routine basis. We do it with industry. The findings are public, and so that we can make it clear to people that we have assessed where the threats come from and that we're responding in a positive way. And we're also making clear, in terms of new developments which come through, that how these issues should be dealt with in planning issues. And the national planning statements look at those issues in terms of flood defences and locations, in terms of where the threats may be going forward, to ensure that adequate provision is taken, and that those are sorted out in advance of an application even being submitted to the Infrastructure Planning Commission, rather than things which could be thought about afterwards. But one can't look at this without also looking at some of the wider issues of gas security of supply. And as I mentioned just now, we are now net importers of gas. Overwhelmingly, that comes from Norway and Qatar. And the government should not be neutral about those sources of supply. We have a national interest and a European interest in securing additional routes to market for gas being imported into Europe. And the government has a responsibility to lead on the development of long-term contracts. And so when the Prime Minister went to Qatar recently, with Centrica as one of the business group which went with him, signing up a 3-year gas deal with them was important, I believe, in terms of saying that we're not going to do this in the way that we've done it in the past. That if this was a long-term gas deal for France, President Sarkozy would sign it. For Germany, Chancellor Merkel would sign it. For Britain, historically, it would be the British ambassador, who is a very fine man or woman, but doesn't give quite the same sense of national urgency and sensitivity, which I think now raising this up to the most senior levels of government will do. And we will be active participants in the debates about how we secure new routes into the European market. There is an urgent need to make progress on a southern corridor. This is being held up for too long. But this should be driven by business. It should not be politicians drawing a line on the map and saying this is the best route. This should be where business is keen to invest, and how it will then unlock some of the incredible potential, such as Shah Deniz 2 in Azerbaijan, and how it will help to bring that into the European market. We are, in the course of the Energy Bill, which has just gone through Parliament, and now the Energy Act, looking at greater obligations on suppliers to make sure that they can meet demand in times of extreme pressure. And making sure there's a higher cash-out price in the event that they fail to meet that. And I think that shows that we're addressing those issues as well. And I hope that will lead to additional investment in storage, because our levels of storage are relevant to a time when we were self-sufficient rather than when we were net importers of gas, but also looking at the greater role for long-term contracts and additional routes for bringing gas into the market. We have to look in terms of the actual physical protection at the danger of malicious threats as well. These could still come from Al-Qaeda. These could also come from splinter groups related to Northern Ireland, that the revival of some of the terrorist activities from small fringe groups there should not be discounted. This is a threat to our national energy infrastructure and our security. And our counter-terrorism strategy, contest, is broken into 4 strands. First of all, preventing people becoming terrorists. Secondly, pursuing the terrorists. Thirdly, protecting our assets to make us less vulnerable to terrorism. And finally, preparing so that if an attack occurs, government can respond to protect life. The protect strand addresses the protection of critical national infrastructure by reducing our vulnerability to attack. And our priorities here are informed by an annual national risk assessment. A version, as many of you will know, is published in the National Risk Register. This assesses the hazards and threats that we face and the vulnerabilities that we have. And from 2011 to 2015, one of our key objectives under Protect is to increase the resilience of the UK's infrastructure. Across the energy sector, we are working with the security and the intelligence agencies to know where and how we are vulnerable to terrorist attack and to reduce these vulnerabilities to an acceptable and proportionate level. We share our priorities with the private sector and with Ofgem, the economic regulator, in order to address them collectively together. DEC, as the lead department for the energy sector, is responsible for setting the security approach, which is criticality-driven, vulnerability-focused and threat-informed. Since 2009, we've increased the level of armed police protection at a number of key sites across the United Kingdom, and we are uncompromising in our commitment in this area. Work has continued with National Grid to improve physical protection at key sites on the electricity and gas transmission networks, and now this physical security upgrade is being extended to critical sites on the distribution networks. And it also looks at some of the historic legacy sites. We have increased in difficult economic times our funding for the decommissioning of the Sellafield nuclear facility. The constraints on that now are simply the physical speed at which that can be done. There is no financial constraint on the work which is being done there, and we have increased that as a priority within our department. Measures have also been developed to identify and address cyber vulnerabilities, because I think we need to recognise the nature of the threat in the years to come could be very different from that which we have historically faced. And we're in the process of finalising our approach, and we'll be publishing a new national cyber security strategy in the coming weeks. But it is clear that our approach must be agile and recognise the importance and skills of CNI owners and operators. So whilst government is responsible for the security of the state, energy and infrastructure is owned by the private sector, and the private sector does profit from it. So the government shares these security risks with the private sector, and it's critical, therefore, that we work in partnership with the private sector to align our risks and reassure one another that mitigations are proportionate. And I know that many of you here today are representing commercial security providers, providing either technical solutions, process controls, or both. Your commercial objectives align with our national security objectives, and we want to work with you to drive up standards and to drive up demand for your services, whilst at the same time working with you to drive the quality of supply to the market with the pull for more demanding and smarter customers. So I hope that we can take a genuinely strategic approach to this. We have a massive challenge in the energy sector. We have to secure £200 billion of new investment in our energy infrastructure over the course of this decade to upgrade our electricity networks, our gas networks, the whole of our generating structure. That we need to replace much of our old plant. We need to see an enormous amount of investment from abroad. We are very much aware that companies making those investments are global companies, that they are looking at global opportunities and they will go where the opportunities are best. So we have to show through the wide range of policies we put in place, economic, fiscal, regulatory, and in terms of the protection of those infrastructure investments, that we are the best place in which to invest. That this is a massive and important part of my brief. We will not cut corners on it. You are people who have the expertise to deliver on that, and it's critical to me that we can work in partnership together. Thank you.